Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to have you all with us today in today's session of the Gerhard Center webinar series, The Aftermath of the COVID-19, the New Social Impact Ecosystem. We launched the series in April with the aim of discussing concepts that are currently not mainstream and may or perhaps should become mainstream in the aftermath of the COVID-19. Today is the 16th session at which we're going to explore philanthropy in Africa. Philanthropy is deep-rooted in the African culture. African generosity has always been a major component in the history of the continent. The last couple of decades witnessed the emergence of more formal channels of philanthropy as response to several calls for more strategic giving that goes beyond aid and relief. Now with the COVID crisis hitting the world, and of course Africa is no exception, in the African context, what role philanthropy plays in the time of COVID-19, and what could be next for African philanthropy? Will it just be a bounce back to the old norm, or are we going to witness more structural changes? Today, we are very lucky to host two great panelists from the Bridgespan Group, who will lead a discussion around African philanthropy in the aftermath of COVID-19, and they will also going to present the main findings of their newly launched report, The Landscape of Large-Scale African Giving and the COVID-19 Era. Before I leave the floor to our very, very special guests, let me first give you a brief introduction about them. We're so much honored to have Jan Schwier. Jan is a partner at the Bridgespan Group, where he leads its Johannesburg office. He serves organizations across the nonprofit sector, focusing on strategy, organizational development, and operating models. Prior to joining Bridgespan, Jan was responsible for the advisory service portfolio of the International Finance Corporation, IFC, in Sub-Saharan Africa. We're also very happy to have Maddie Holland. Maddie is a case team leader at the Bridgespan Group. Since joining Bridgespan in 2016, she has worked with both philanthropy and NGO clients across several fields, covering topics such as early childhood development, girls' education, and empowerment, NGO scaling strategies. Maddie has supported organizations working in the US, Sub-Saharan Africa, India, and the UAE, and she is also founding member of the Bridgespan Africa Initiative team. Welcome, guys, and thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Great, Carmen. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk about some very recent research that we completed, and to have the opportunity to share it with this audience, and to hopefully also learn and get feedback that can take us to the next level of research. I will give a quick introduction, give you also just a little bit of background on Bridgespan. Some of you might be familiar with us, others might not be. Give you an overview of the research approach in general, and then my colleague Maddie will take you through most of the findings, and then we hope to have enough time for questions and comments. So if you go to the next page, I'll prompt you, Maddie. Thank you. So who's Bridgespan? We are a non-profit organization ourselves, and Bridgespan is about 20 years old. And our aim is to strengthen the ability of mission-driven organizations and leaders and philanthropists to improve their ability to have breakthrough results in the world. We try and have our impact in that sense through the success of other organizations that are in the social sector broadly. How do we do that? We do that through 4 types of work, really. One is we work with nonprofit and NGO organizations to help them in shaping their strategy, help them improve their ability to have impact and to scale their results. We do that secondly by working with philanthropists and philanthropic organizations, as well as impact investors, to help shape that flow of capital and to increase the flow of capital into the social sector. Thirdly, we try and help organizations in strengthening their leadership cohort and their ability to work together as a leadership. And then lastly, which brings us to today, we have the ability by ourselves raising some philanthropic funds to dedicate that to developing and sharing insights, which we hope can either move the social sector or trigger some discussion that we hope would be helpful to advancing the social sector at large. So really what we are doing today is sharing work that is in that green bubble that you see in front of you on the screen that we've undertaken over the last weeks. And Maddie and I represent a team of 4 authors that have worked on that. And I'm the gentleman at the top there. So if you go to the next slide, Maddie. So the objective we hope to achieve in today's discussion is really twofold. One, we wanted to share and discuss the learnings on the landscape of large-scale African giving. We will go a little bit more into those definitions. What do we mean by that? What is our definition and how did we do that? And then secondly, move into what we are starting to see as sort of first emerging patterns of how African philanthropy is and has been responding to COVID-19, but also to other maybe similar, maybe not similar crises, pandemics and events in the past. You know, to try and see whether some of those first signals that we're observing from the data resonate with you as an audience. So that's the twofold agenda for today. So how did we go about this, and what's the frame from which we have drawn the conclusions that we will share with you today? When we started this research, we asked ourselves 3 questions. One, are there significant large philanthropic gifts across the African continent? And who are the philanthropists that are giving large gifts? So the first really question that we asked ourselves is, can we put together an evidence-based data that supports large-scale giving across Africa, and who are the philanthropists that are doing it? Secondly, are there any trends? Can we discern any trends from that data? Are there signals that we can observe from that data that would lead us into a discussion about where is that kind of giving heading? And then thirdly, because we have done research as an organization in other geographies about the same topic, so large-scale giving, can we see any differences? Can we see any patterns that would allow us to compare between African giving and non-African giving? So the way we did that was through interviews that we've used twofold. One, to discern views and opinions on this, but secondly, also to get some guidance and critique along the way of our work. And with a number of people, we've done that several times to make sure that we are not stating the obvious, and that we're also looking at this topic with the appropriate amount of humility. You know, even speaking about African philanthropy, we can have a long discussion. What does that even mean? Does that exist? And you know, we wanted to make sure that we have guidance along the way. Secondly, we looked at a lot of the work that has been done today. We didn't start from nowhere. Many organizations have done really good and interesting research in the past on this. There's at least 20 plus significant pieces of research. Some of them we mentioned very explicitly in our work also, and they've been very good. So we leveraged that. And then in addition to the data set that we have uncovered on the topic of today, we also had the ability to look at previous work where we had some 200 gifts from non-African donors directed onto the continent, philanthropic donors, that we took as a comparison point. All of this is to say that we try to bring, I think, into this perspective a combination of data and structured interview opinions in order to discern what we're talking about today. With that, I'll hand over to my colleague Maddie, who will take you through some of the specifics and then some of the key themes that have emerged, and then we'll conclude with a Q&A.
Thanks, Jan. So as Jan mentioned, one of the first questions that we asked ourselves was, can we actually find examples of large-scale gifts from African donors, and can we start to build a bit of a sample to start to analyze what we can observe about those large gifts? So we were able to identify 63 gifts from donors across 5 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We were able to come up with a sample, which was over $1 billion in terms of total value. To put some parameters around, what qualifies as a large gift, we were looking for gifts over $1 million in size, made between the years of 2010 and 2019, and committed by sub-Saharan African donors to causes within sub-Saharan Africa. So we excluded, for example, any instances of giving from a donor in Africa to an academic institution outside of Africa, for example. And we also just really relied on publicly available data for this research. So as Jan mentioned, we consulted many of the existing pieces of research that have been conducted on this topic, foundation websites, also just really a lot of news articles to learn about examples of large gifts that had been made. And what you see on the left is essentially some detail about the gifts that we found. So of the 63 gifts, the majority that we were able to find were from donors based in Nigeria. Also found a sizable share of gifts from South Africa. And the remainder were from Zimbabwe, Tanzania, and Kenya. I think one important point that we want to stress is that we recognize that this is in no way a comprehensive view of philanthropy in Africa for a few different reasons. The first is that, there's such a long history and culture around giving in Africa. And so philanthropy is by no means kind of limited to this large structured giving. It's really just one segment of giving that we focused our research on, but we recognize that it is not representative of the whole sort of body of philanthropy on the continent. The second piece is that we've really focused on sub-Saharan Africa. And this was really just out of a desire to kind of bound the scope of our research. But we recognize that there are examples of large gifts in North Africa as well, including in Egypt from the Schwier Foundation, for example. And the third is just to underscore this point about our use of publicly available data. This sort of limited our view to gifts that have been publicly reported and that are sort of easily accessible through news articles or are posted on foundation websites. But we recognize that there is a lot of large-scale giving that is not necessarily reported or as easily sort of traceable through those publicly available sources. That being said, we did feel that this sample of 63 gifts totaling $1 billion across 5 countries was at least sort of a sizable enough sample to enable us to start to make some observations and start a conversation about what we can learn about the landscape of large-scale giving. So our research surfaced 3 themes, and so I'll just sort of give an introduction to the 3 now, and then we'll step through each of them on the following slides. The first theme was that African donors tend to give primarily within their own countries, and we see a few examples in the sample of donors giving to other countries in Africa outside of their own. The second is that the large gifts in our sample are predominantly aimed at meeting basic needs, such as poverty eradication, health, and education. And the third is that African donors give predominantly to the public sector, as well as to their own operating foundations, meaning that they implement the programs directly as opposed to engaging in grant making in a lot of instances. So starting with the first theme. So one of the first questions we asked ourselves was, where are these gifts going in terms of, the geographic focus? And it was clear in our sample that the vast majority, so 81% of gifts, were actually made within the donor's home country. We had a lot of interesting conversations with some of the folks that we interviewed about why this is, and a number of reasons were cited, but we'll just name a couple here. The first is that philanthropy in Africa, but as in other parts of the world, is a deeply personal endeavor. So donors tend to give to causes or institutions that are close to their heart, that they've had some sort of personal interaction with, or they can really, they feel some personal connection to, based on, it being in their community or having had a role in their own personal life. So that tends to just sort of naturally direct donors to focus their giving on their own community or their own country. Another point that was raised was on a more sort of practical or logistical side. There are just some challenges that a donor faces in actually moving money across borders to different countries on the continent. Different regulatory environments, for example, might make it challenging for a donor to give into a different country. We did also want to look at sort of the example of gifts that were given outside the donor's home country. So those 12 gifts that are in sort of the gray piece of the pie chart there. And while we recognize this is a very small sample, it's only 12 gifts, I think there are some interesting observations just to name around what can help explain those examples of non-domestic giving. So 3 instances really rose to the top. The first is giving to disaster relief and disease eradication. So 8 of those 12 gifts were really in response to some disaster that had occurred outside of the donor's home country. So giving in response to the Ebola crisis is a great example of this. We saw philanthropists from across the continent really kind of rallying together and funding the cluster of countries that were most affected by that outbreak. The second is giving to academic institutions, so funding research, for example, at a university outside the donor's home country. And the third is around following the donor's business footprint. So there are a couple examples of donors whose business is really Pan-African in nature. And so for that donor, they already have many of the structures and capabilities in place to be able to sort of follow their business footprint and engage in Pan-African giving. So one example is the Tony Elumelu Foundation's $100 million gift to entrepreneurship, which has really been a Pan-African effort. And that's in part driven by sort of the philosophy of the philanthropist and really wanting to have an impact at a Pan-African scale. But it's also been driven by the fact that his business already had sort of that multi-country reach, and he was really able to leverage that Pan-African structure in his giving. So moving on to theme 2, a second question that we asked was, what cause is our donors giving to in our sample? And what we found is that a vast majority of the giving in the sample went to what we've termed basic needs. So if you look at the bar chart on the left, about 77% of giving from African donors went to meeting basic needs. And it's a similar story for the non-African donors, where 73% of giving went towards meeting basic needs. In terms of sort of what qualifies as basic needs, we borrowed from an existing framework which clusters the Sustainable Development Goals into a few different categories. So what's on the right-hand side of the slide is really just showing the SDGs that qualify in the basic needs category. But if we look at the basic needs that African donors are most focused on in our sample, it was really gifts around poverty eradication, health, as well as education. When we spoke to our interviewees about why there is this focus on basic needs, the first point that came up was just really around sort of there being a natural hierarchy or sequencing of needs. So a lot of philanthropists feel that there is sort of a natural sequence. You need to address sort of urgent poverty needs. You need to address health and education before other societal changes related to democracy or some of the themes that you see in some of the other SDGs can be addressed. So that sort of philosophy around there being a natural sequencing is part of what's driving this focus on basic needs. The second observation that came up was that in some instances, funding basic needs can be sort of a safer choice for philanthropists because funding causes such as health or education can be seen as sort of less contentious politically, whereas other topics related to social justice, for example, we do see some philanthropists focusing on those topics, but it's kind of taking you into a slightly different territory politically. So in that sense, focusing on basic needs is also sort of a safer bet for philanthropists. But the final thing I wanted to mention on that slide is that we recognize that this kind of framing around basic needs is is definitely an imperfect framework. And one of the nuances that one of our interviewees called out was, which I thought was quite helpful, was just to notice that even within each of these SDGs, within basic needs, the strategy that a philanthropist employs could vary widely. So within education, for example, that would range from, funding a new school to be built to actually thinking about changing the education system in a more holistic way. So just to say that there's no sort of monolithic approach that we're seeing within this basic needs category, and the strategies that a given philanthropist employs would potentially vary. Moving to the third theme, another question that we asked was, where are African donors in the sample putting their money in terms of the type of entity that they're funding? And what we found is that the vast majority of funding goes to public sector entities as well as operating foundations, leaving limited funding for local African-based NGOs. So if you look at the bar chart on the left-hand side of the page, starting with public sector, so 42% of gifts in our sample went to public sector entities such as local ministries, government departments, and funds that had been set up by the African Union, for example. And some of the reasons why we heard that this is such a prevalent strategy for giving is just kind of links back to what we saw on the previous slide around the focus on health, education, and disaster relief, and the fact that in those sectors, the government is the dominant or one of the dominant actors, so there's sort of a natural fit there based on the causes that philanthropists are focused on. Moving to operating foundations, so 33% of giving in our sample flows through operating foundations. And some of the reasons that we heard for that are really around just sort of the practicality of being able to leverage the sort of resources and capabilities that you have within your company or within your foundation. So if you already have sort of the networks, the capabilities, the team in place, it can sometimes just feel like a more natural fit to just implement your programs directly. And as I mentioned, there's a very small share in the African donors bar going towards local African-based organizations. So that's just at 9% of gifts in the sample. When we look at the non-African donors bar, we see a much smaller share going to public sector at only 20%. And we saw no example of gifts going through an operating foundation in the non-African donor section. We did see a much higher share of grant-making activity among non-African donors. So if you see the international organization and local organization segments, it shows that, over 70% of gifts are going to NGOs. But it's worth calling out that within that category of NGOs, the vast majority of funding is actually going to international organizations. So these would be, for example, INGOs, which may have a regional presence in Africa and actually doing work in Africa, but they're headquartered outside of the continent. So again, within non-African donors, there's still a relatively small share of funding at 14% going to local African organizations. So this question around limited funding going to local African organizations really stood out to us. And we began to have some conversations with some of our interviewees about why this is. And a few themes rose to the top. The first is around scale. So we heard that there are few examples of local African NGOs that are operating at scale across multiple different countries. So this came up primarily in the context of non-African donors who might be looking to reach Pan-African scale with their giving. And if that's sort of their ingoing desire, there's sort of a natural limitation that happens where they end up giving to INGOs because INGOs tend to be the organizations that have that Pan-African scale. The second observation we heard is related to trust. So some of our interviewees mentioned that donors, both African and non-African, sometimes have a sense of lack of trust towards NGOs. And so that might lead them to fund through their own operating foundation, for example, or fund the public sector instead. And the third observation was around political considerations. So I think this really derives from this idea that civil society is not always viewed favorably in certain countries or in certain communities. So donors might be wary about funding civil society organizations and would prefer to sort of protect their government relationships rather than taking the risk of being seen as funding civil society organizations. So as we kind of jump forward to present day, looking at the response that we've seen by many African philanthropists to the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the questions on our mind is really, what, if anything, is different about philanthropy's response to the COVID crisis as compared to what we've seen in our sample? So here on this slide, we just have a few examples of philanthropists who have, moved early and made very sizable commitments to respond to urgent needs that are resulting from the pandemic. So as you can see, there's multiple examples across a variety of different countries. And so we're looking to really understand if and how this differs from what we've observed in our sample of 63 gifts. So one observation that we've made is that when we look at the gifts in our sample, there is sort of a large precedent for philanthropists actually stepping up and responding to a crisis, similar to what we've seen in the fallout of the COVID crisis. So within our sample, if we look at the 63 gifts in terms of number of gifts, almost 30% of those commitments have been made in response to some sort of disaster or crisis. So for example, we see the Masiyiwa family donating $70 million to fight cholera in Zimbabwe. We saw Matsepe committing $1 million to respond to the cyclone in Zimbabwe. And again, of course, we had the example of the many different commitments that were made to fight Ebola several years ago. So as we look at the role that philanthropy has played so far to date and could play in the future, we can think about there being sort of several phases of response to pandemics. So this is a framework that came from a separate piece of research that our colleagues at Bridgespan in the US conducted. But I think it's sort of a helpful frame to discuss the context in Africa as well. So it seems like a lot of the gifts to date in response to COVID have really been in this category in kind of the upper right-hand side of the slide called response. So really responding quickly to ramp up public health efforts, to fund sort of acute and urgent economic needs in response to the crisis. And I think the question now, which we hope to discuss with all of you in the Q&A, is really, what will the role of philanthropy look like going forward? So as we move from response to recovery, and there's sort of more of a need to take a medium or long-term approach to think about economic, social, health systems, and really the longer-term recovery of communities and countries in Africa. Moving beyond recovery, there's also a question around actually building more resilient and stronger health systems in order to ensure that communities are better guarded against similar situations in the future. And I think here there's a real opportunity to focus on some of the inequities that have been surfaced since the onset of the pandemic. So there's a question around what role philanthropy can play in actually kind of strengthening systems for the longer term. And similarly, moving into preparedness, are there ways to ensure that these systems, in addition to being more equitable, are also more prepared for future instances and similar crises? So I'll just conclude with some of the questions that are on our minds. And we would love to hear input from this group today, whether during the Q&A or even afterwards. Feel free to reach out to us. But some of the questions on our mind include, given your perspective on African philanthropy, do you agree with the findings in our report? What are your reactions to the way that African philanthropists have responded to the COVID crisis so far? And what are the resulting questions for African philanthropy moving forward that would be helpful for further focus and analysis? And this could be, in terms of the response to COVID or even just more broadly, given some of the other themes that were mentioned earlier on in the presentation. So I will conclude there, and we can just open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Jan. Thank you, Maddie, for this for presenting this informative report. We really appreciate all the effort you guys put in this study, and perhaps in the future we should work together to complement your research and look at North Africa, maybe compare notes. Okay, I'm sure the audience have lots of questions, but before we go there, let me share with you some thoughts and questions I have in mind, and I would love to hear your insights. It's related actually to the third theme or the third finding of your study. Some argue that through big gifts to public sector, business elites could indirectly protect a flawed economic system that causes most of the socioeconomic ills, as it gives the signals that the big guys are doing enough. And this can compel government and people to turn the blind eye to the importance of revisiting the rule of the game, the roots of the inequality problems, for example. I'm talking here about progressive taxation, allowing unions, promoting healthy competitive markets, offering decent jobs. All these structural issues won't come to the negotiation table as long as the big guys are giving back. My question is, could high net worth giving protect the interest of crony capitalists to maintain a system that feeds the inequality problem in the continent and beyond? This is the general question, not necessarily in Africa.
Would you like us to answer right away, or do you have other questions,
yes,
Carmen?
Yeah, please go ahead, and then I will.
Well, I think my first reaction is it's a big question, and one where I would say a few observations might be helpful from our perspective. One is, why has this issue of large philanthropic gifts been of interest to us working with the social sector? And it plays into what you've talked about a little bit, as far as just the structure in which and from which philanthropic wealth is being generated, which I think is at the root of what you're discussing. And one of the things that we are observing and have observed over the years is that wealth that wants to find its way into the world of the social sector is growing at a faster pace than actually the ability to reach the social sector. So the two curves are not in line. That means wealth is growing faster than the ability of the social sector actually to receive it, or the amounts that are going into it. And we have been looking at why that is for some time. And I think there's multiple different answers, and they might be different depending on individual philanthropy or more institutional philanthropy. But one of the things that we've looked at is whether there is an inbuilt hesitance or risk aversion of philanthropists to give large amounts to specific causes, for which there are many, many good examples of where substantial large philanthropic gifts have really moved topics structurally over the years in a very significant way. And so we focused some of our research on what can be done in order to lower either that risk perception or to just generate more interest and more ability to make these large gifts. And a lot has to do with how organizations are representing sometimes the topics, how do they convince philanthropic funders, but also how are these funders themselves thinking about risk and sort of their criteria. And so that's what's led us to looking at large gifts. But I think one of our hypotheses as an organization is, unless we bring more large gifts into the social sector, the curves of philanthropic wealth generation, and in a way, the ability of the social sector to make a structural difference into these systems, is going to be more and more out of sync. So we have to do something about moving more philanthropic capital in big, large amounts into the social sector. And I think that's why we're trying to focus on this. And I think that's the only way in which you can get to some of the underlying issues. Now you said, is there a risk that large philanthropic money can actually cause the entrenchment of certain structures? And I think the answer is that it all depends on what the intent of your gift is and what your motivation is and what some of the conditions and boundaries and philosophies are around which you give. And I think the best way that we as an organization can address that is by being very careful and very mindful about the choices of where do we support this and where might we not. But as Maddie said, I think philanthropy, in most countries is a voluntary activity. In some countries, it's a mandatory activity that is enshrined even in some laws. But because it is voluntary, right, it's unpredictable in a sense, where might it go? So I think it's very hard for me to say, no, there is no such risk. I think I would not be telling the truth. I think the best way you can try and address that is by guiding as much philanthropic capital into things that address underlying structural issues and to try and increase these amounts. Because otherwise more and more wealth is just building up and it doesn't find its way into the sector. I think that's the main thing we want to try and address.
Thank you so much. Another question. The current crisis have exposed many structural and institutional issues in many sectors globally, not just in our continent. My question is, in the African context, what are the main institutional gaps in the philanthropy ecosystem that the crisis have exposed, and what could be done to fill these gaps if they do exist?
So we've had a couple of first sort of observations, and maybe Maddie, you could share some of sort of the themes that are coming out, which I think might be pointing to that. Would that be a way to address that maybe?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, that sounds great. So I think some of the themes that have come up around, what should be on the forefront of philanthropy's mind in response to the crisis. There are a few themes that we've come across just from reading and listening to some of the other webinars that others in this field have conducted. I think the first is just around bringing a mindset about how to be sort of perhaps more flexible and supportive of your grantees than you would otherwise. So recognizing that this is going to be a tumultuous time for your grantees from a financial health perspective, thinking about getting money out the door as quickly as possible and providing as flexible as possible funding to the grantees so that they can deploy it in the way that they see most fit in order to be most responsive to the needs on the ground. So I think that shift in mindset about providing flexible and responsive funds to grantees is one important theme. The second is really around thinking about working closely with communities. And thinking about ways in which you can fund really trusted community leaders because they are in the best position to know what the needs of the community are. So philanthropy really stepping up and thinking, how can I work closely with folks on the ground who are most familiar and most close to the context in order to really be kind of community driven in my philanthropy. The third is around ensuring that there's sort of a root cause or longer term lens being brought to giving during this time. So I think we've seen, in other parts of the world, the sort of initial phase of philanthropic giving in response to the COVID has really been, again, in this response phase. So really thinking about meeting the most urgent and pressing needs, given that they are very real right now. But going forward, it'll be important for philanthropy to take a longer term lens and think about addressing some of the root causes. So coming back to this point about inequity in the existing system, I think globally we're seeing that the most vulnerable communities are being disproportionately affected by this pandemic. And so can philanthropy play a role in actually rebuilding in reshaping some of these systems by putting equity at the forefront and ensuring that kind of the root cause of some of these challenges are addressed. So those are maybe not specific to your question around the ecosystem, but I think those are some of the themes that have come up in the reading that we found helpful to think about, what should be at the forefront of philanthropic response going forward.
Thank you so much, Maddie. Just two questions before we go to the audience. In September 2019, just 2 months before the COVID crisis, a report issued by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development warns that the African inequality could be even worse unless radical action is taken to bridge the continent's digital divide. With the COVID crisis hitting hard, this digital divide is expected to be even worse. What's the role can high net worth African philanthropy play in addressing this issue?
So again, I would say I think the most important thing is moving in that circular framework, I think that we've shown a little bit earlier, more towards addressing the underlying root issues that expose the existing inequities and actually amplify the inequities in a phase of crisis and health crisis as we are experiencing it today. I think that's definitely one thing. I think that requires a shift of mindset, I think, on behalf of philanthropy. But I think it also requires that organizations that are the counterpart for philanthropy also think about, how can I make my own organization? How can we bring our organization into a better position so that those requirements of this philanthropic capital can be met by what we can also in a way bring to it? I think that's one thing. And then I think the second thing is to come back to this first observation my colleague shared, is to broaden the mindset around how you can step up in the moment. And I think philanthropy, especially institutional philanthropy, of course, for during normal times, is guided by sound financial principles, right? How much do you give? How much does your endowment return? I think what we're seeing is some really interesting developments, for example, of broadening that perspective. I don't know if some of you have followed, for example, an initiative that the Ford Foundation is leading currently to explore, for example, in a much more aggressive way, instruments of debt to step up as an additional instrument in this moment, in addition to grant making out of the endowed philanthropic capital that they have. That is a significant shift and could really change the way in which philanthropy steps up and into the moment, I would say, in a very different way. I think another very interesting example is in South Africa itself. I think the creation of the Solidarity Fund, I think stands out, at least to us, as a really interesting example of a much more concerted effort between philanthropic partners and government, even in its very leadership and exposure, as a way to create a structure that in this particular moment kind of addresses things in a much more synchronized way. And I think a lot more of those sorts of, innovations, are a way in which you could address and lean into it and just find different pathways, for philanthropy to play a role. So those are two that at least come to my mind, which strike me as different and new, that this moment has created.
Thank you so much. One final note. I'm asking about the sustainability or survival of NGOs that are working on issues that might not seem like a priority given the COVID crisis and its unfavorable consequences. So I'm like NGOs working on gender equality, on environment, things like that. How are they surviving now with the shift in the philanthropy resources?
I think that's a really important question, and it's one that links to sort of, again, coming back to this shift from response to recovery. So I think with the initial focus on response, it's really been very much focused on, this is a health problem first and foremost initially, and Also, there's some immediate economic follow-up, but I think a lot of giving has understandably focused on sort of those sectors, given the nature of the crisis. But I think moving forward, it will really be important for philanthropy to take sort of a broader aperture to thinking about supporting multiple different types of NGOs, working on multiple different kinds of issues, because I think what has already been clear and will likely continue to become more clear is that the crisis is going to affect multiple different segments of society and really have ramifications for not just health, but for education, for all sorts of different causes that are important to donors. So I think just sort of donors bring, like, in addition to sort of a longer term lens, also having a wider aperture to how they think about their response to the crisis will be really important. And I think to your point specifically about gender equality, I think there's another just link back there to this notion of equity and really thinking about, regardless of what sector you're focusing on, especially in response to the crisis, just a need to really center the most vulnerable populations and ensure you're sort of putting equity at the forefront, given the impact that the crisis has had on disproportionately affecting those communities.
But just to add to that comment, I think it's definitely worth and true saying that while I think a lot more philanthropic capital has found its way into, I think, the social sector, at least over the short to medium term, not all organizations have benefited from that. And I think there is a portion of social sector organizations who are in an existential crisis, who are really suffering as a result of these shifts of funding. And so I think that is true. I think there are some that have benefited and some that are looking at much more difficult times ahead. I think that is definitely true, and how that will play out and how they can find their way back, I think it's going to be a struggle for some organizations. I think we see that and we observe that, and I think that's true.
Thank you so much, Jan. Thank you, Maddie. Luci, can we have some of the audience questions, please?
Yes. Thank you for the presentation and the research. It's very insightful. I'll ask questions in rounds. Can you hear me first?
Yes, perfect. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Perfect. Okay, I'll ask the questions in rounds, 2 or 3 questions per round. Is that okay? Okay.
Yes, that's great.
Okay, I proceed. Okay, the first round of questions. First, please clarify, you mentioned that the giving was 42% for public sector, 33% for own footprint, 9% for local organizations. What are the 16%, the other 16% for? That's just a clarifying question. And then I have one question. You mentioned big philanthropists in Africa give mainly to public sector or to their own operating foundations, with limited funding reaching the NGOs. Is this due to the immaturity of the social ecosystem in Africa? If yes, how do we break the gridlock and get funding and capacity building to develop the social ecosystem in Africa? Thank you.
So I can answer your first question on what's in that other category. So that is a mix of a few different things. Some of it is funding to private sector entities, so social businesses, microfinance institutions. Those were placed into the other category. And there was also some examples of funds or sort of pledges of money that were pledged towards sort of unspecified uses. So if there was an instance where we couldn't quite categorize what the money was, if it didn't quite neatly fit into one of those other categories, then we would just put it in the other. But it's primarily funding for social businesses and private entities. I think on your second question, I'll just give my quick thoughts and then would love to hear yours as well, Jan. I think the giving to public sector and operating foundations, I certainly would not characterize that as due to the immaturity of giving in the sector. I think the focus on operating foundations is not unique to Africa. It's something that is very prevalent as well in India, for example. So I think, I don't think that we are bringing any sort of value judgment to grant making to NGOs versus giving through operating foundations. It's more just a different vehicle for your giving. And you can apply, you know, really strong, good, high impact principles through an operating foundation or through grant making. So those are that's my response, but Jan.
No, I would agree, but I would say, I think, at least from our perspective, to quite specifically continue uncovering, are there specific barriers to capital, right, to philanthropic or impact investing capital that local NGOs face, which certainly this data suggests that there is an imbalance, right? Even if you live with the fact that our sample is not all encompassing, right, it's not perfect in its composition, that is a data point that sort of triggers the question of we need to look further behind that data. What are those barriers? Is that hypothesis actually correct? That there's either structural, organizational capability barriers to local NGOs that have to be addressed in order to kind of level the playing field more. I think that's definitely a question on our mind, is that might be one area that will deserve a lot more credit, a lot more focus going forward. But I would agree, I don't think you can conclude from that the sector is immature. I think to me more the question is, this data imbalance that we've observed, I think is worthy of looking into much more specifically, because that strikes us as something that over the long run, kind of a more equitable representation of different types of organizations would in general benefit the social sector across Africa.
Okay, thank you. Some other questions? Again, you mentioned that some of the gifts are to academic institutions. What do you think were the motivations behind those gifts? How similar or different they are from gifts to universities in the Western world? Also, you mentioned that the giving was mainly for securing the basic needs of citizens. Is the main role, and that's the main role of the government. The focus of the philanthropists on basic needs is intended to compensate for the shortcoming of the government? And to what extent is there coordination with the government and other donors to ensure effective giving toward the basic needs? Thank you.
Thank you. So to answer your first question about giving to academic institutions, I think the gifts in the sample really are limited to two purposes. One is funding research efforts. So there would be gifts to University of Cape Town, for example, to fund a specific research initiative. And then the other is gifts for to be used as scholarship for students to go to school. So I think both of those examples we do see in the US and other parts of the world. I think what we haven't seen in this sample is sort of a large gift to a university to build a new library or something like that. That type of giving to academic institutions is not actually currently in our sample. It's really focused on research and scholarship funding. So that's what I would say to that one. Jan, do you want to answer the second question?
Well, just to add to the first one, I think there was a question around, is it comparable to what you see, for example, in the US? I'd say one observation is that the extent and the degree of large philanthropic giving towards academic institutions is very, very, very developed in the United States in a completely different level. So not at all comparable to what we've observed in this data set. So that when we actually speak about these large philanthropic gifts in a geography like the United States, we would quite explicitly exclude that type of giving because it is so large that it really has a massive impact on how you look at data around that. And I think key observation is that still is more singular examples based on the data that we've seen versus kind of the very significant amount that you see in a geography like the United States. I would say on the second question, did we detect or did we take from our interviews that this kind of more basic needs oriented giving is motivated by a perception of shortcoming of government? I would say at least my impression has not been that is a direct motivator. I think it's certainly correct that in many countries, governments could be much better resourced, right? That could be a lot more that the public purse could contribute to improving the ability of government to step into those areas. But my sense is that what we've picked up was more coming from, I think, this sort of perception of hierarchy of needs from the beneficiary side that's motivating it versus trying to compensate weakness on the government side. I think that struck us as more of the motivator than anything else. At least I didn't pick up that was a key motivator for philanthropists to stepping into that space. Is it an underlying issue? You cannot deny that is in a number of countries for sure.
There was another part of that question. Do you believe there is a coordination between the philanthropist and the government and other donors? Yeah.
So we certainly didn't pick up from our discussions that across all of the geographies where we've had data that, let's say over the past 10 years, the degree of coordination between philanthropy and government is a completely different level, let's say, as it was maybe 10 years ago. So as a major trend line, I would say we didn't pick that up. I would more point towards some of the examples that we spoke about, which stand out as ways in which that can be possible. And then again, point to, I think, previous health or natural disaster crises, which probably are the best examples of really highly coordinated efforts. But can you discern from the data that we have that there's a massive shift of better or worse coordination between government and philanthropy? My sense, at least, is that we wouldn't be able to conclude that.
Okay. Many problems facing many countries in Africa is around refugees or terrorism, and these are across cross-border activities. Yet we find philanthropists mainly give in their own countries. We'd like to hear your comments about this. Also about how do you describe the lack of large scale of philanthropic activities in many regions in Africa?
Sorry, could you just repeat the second one? I was taking notes, unless Maddie, you caught it, but I was. I think the first one was on refugees, yes?
Yes, the cross-border activities like refugees and terrorism. And the second one is around the lack of large scale of philanthropic activities in many regions in Africa.
So maybe we could start with the second one. I don't know, you have a perspective on the second question? I'm thinking about how to answer the first one. It's not a straightforward question.
Sure. Yeah. So on the second one, I think what I would just say is that the countries that we see represented in the sample to some extent also represent, at least directionally, kind of the wealth distribution on the continent. So in that sense, the countries such as Nigeria, South Africa, it wasn't too surprising to us or to our interviewees that those were sort of the kind of major countries of philanthropic activity. And then in addition to that, because there's this other finding around lack of giving outside your home country, and a lot of the giving stays concentrated within the donor's home country, I think that also adds to the explanation of why there's disproportionately less funding flowing to other countries outside of our 5-country sample. So that's what I would say in response to the second question.
Yeah, and just to add to that, at some point during our research, we actually tried to see whether we could make a database comparison of the amount of large-scale giving as compared to, for example, wealth in the country or the economic kind of parameters of a country. And we quite purposely stayed away from it because we actually were not sure whether the data set that we have, is broad and representative enough to go all the way into those types of conclusions. I think we're quite comfortable discerning these signals and kind of early themes from it. But for example, to conclude that the level and degree of wealth is higher or larger, and to discern from that, I think we weren't quite there yet, because I think we still assume that there's a lot of large scale giving that we haven't been able to capture just because it is very private, and the amount of that might actually be disproportionately higher across African countries. And that might just be a function of reporting requirements, which are simply different across geographies. And so we felt like we have to do more work to get maybe just a better sense for the data to come to those types of conclusions. I think the issue of refugees is tricky. It's I think it's a space that I think a number of philanthropic donors are very committed to and interested in.
You're on mute, Jan. Sorry.
Oh, so you missed my first complete piece. So let me repeat. On the first question, my point was that at some point, actually, we did make an attempt to compare whether or not philanthropic giving and wealth or economic activity in a country could be compared across geographies based on the sample sets that we had. We quite deliberately stayed away from that because we felt that we were not quite there yet in terms of the data that we had. And so I think that's probably, in my mind, more work still to be done to really get at the bottom of, is there really less or is there more large-scale giving across African countries as compared to other geographies or not? I think our sample set is, we felt comfortable enough discerning the sort of themes from that we've shared with you. But I think to make these kinds of comparisons, we were not quite convinced yet that we had it. And that is just because we assume that there is a lot of large-scale giving that we haven't captured, just because it's private in its nature and not publicly available. Then I want to come to the topic of refugees. I think that's a really big and tricky issue. I think there is some interest in the sector on that. There's also increased, I would say, momentum of the private sector to engage in the issue of refugees and host communities. But I think it's been more the domain of bilateral and multilateral aid. And I think that's a historic, way of looking at that issue also, and where the responsibility for addressing it ought to lie. And I think that's slowly shifting. And my sense is that as a big issue, it has maybe not made its way into philanthropy the way we speak about it yet. But that's more because of the historic, I would say, role and responsibility of large multilateral and UN-based agencies in that space, who've of course done a lot of work and do huge amounts of really important work there. Sorry, I was on mute.
Thank you so much, Jan. Thank you so much, Maddie. That was a conversation I enjoyed a lot, and I'm sure the participants learned a lot from you. And I also would like to thank each and everyone attended this session. We actually have people attending from Africa, Middle East, North America, Europe, Southeast Asia. I'm very happy with the diversity. So thank you so much, and see you in the next Gerhard Center webinar. It's about transformative social impact in the context of the COVID-19. It should be next Tuesday. So thanks a lot, and stay safe. Dr. Ali, would you like to?
I just want to thank Jan and Maddie. This was very interesting, and I want to thank the audience, and I look forward to further engagement from the audience and of course from Bridgespan. Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Maddie. It's been really very informative. Thank you, Kariman, for the moderation, and Iman and Lucia, all the team. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye. Bye.